Chapter 33 to 38. Bulma, ever practical, insisted on evacuating. If he finds an empty planet he'll just blow it up and keep looking, Gine countered. Then the fighters can stay. But there's no reason I, or any of the Namekians, should just sit around waiting for our fate when we have two perfectly good spaceships at our disposal. But you're the only one that knows how to drive either of them, Krillin pointed out. Then I'll put the old one on autopilot. Bulma snapped. My point is, the ship my dad made can easily fit everyone that wants to be well out of the way when a galactic space tyrant shows up in a temper. Which includes me. Aren't you curious what he looks like? Krillin asked. Bulma stared at him. Not really. The Grand Elder nodded. It is a good plan. This would need to be done quickly, Nail said. We can split up and give everybody the news, Chi-Chi said. And help carry the children. I think we could probably leave in a few hours if there are no delays, Bulma said. She studied the Grand Elder with her head cocked to one side. What I don't know how to deal with is you, no offense. Can you stand? I will not be going, the Grand Elder said, and this sparked a tense discussion between him and Nail, joined by Yamcha, who didn't understand, and Chi-Chi, who did. Gine listened from the window. Normally she might have joined in, but she already knew what her part in all this would be, and there was nothing more for her to say. The initial rush of power after the Grand Elder had lifted his hand away had been enough to make her giddy with possibility. Vegeta's extra power had briefly made him stronger than her again, but now she was back on top. She could kill him, easily, and never have to see his stupid, smirking face again. It was tempting. It would be so easy. She turned from the Grand Elder's chair, power coursing through her, seeking out Vegeta's power, but her eyes had landed on Dende, still being consoled by Gohan, and the sight was like a shock of cold water down her back. She didn't want to be a killer. She wanted her garden. She wanted sunny days in forest-ringed meadows, the laughter of grandchildren and great-grandchildren echoing through the trees. She wanted Raditz, safe and happy, and Kakarot and Chi-Chi and both Gohans and all her friends around her. She wanted peace. Not more blood on her hands. She wanted. She'd retreated to the window without a word, homesick for something she couldn't define. Bulma broke up the discussion, which was getting heated. Well, regardless, we need to get out there and tell everybody. Who's going where? I'll go to Tsuburi's village, Krillin said, and swooped out of the house to do so. I've got Lien, Gohan said, following him. Kakarot stepped up to Gine. Ma, he said quietly. You alright? She turned from the window. He was looking at her worriedly, and she decided it was time to stop moping. She had a job to do. I'm fine, son, she said, smiling. I'll go to the village I can feel over there, the farthest one. Nail nodded in the direction she was pointing. The elder there is named Abalon. Oh, he was so nice, Chi-Chi remarked. His little boy Bana wanted to know how I make my clothes. I'll be back soon, Gine said, and took off. Behind her they started arguing again. She had picked this village because it was far, but not just to spare the others. She needed time alone, though as she traveled it became increasingly clear that on Namek, solitude was not hard to find. Gine flew over devastated landscapes and softly rolling hills, vast fields of grass and oceans dotted with archipelagos. There was a keen-edged loneliness to this planet she hadn't had time to notice before. In the several hundred miles she'd flown already, she'd seen no trace of civilization. No crumbling buildings or overgrown gardens. No fire pits or bodies of water with two perfect edges. Everywhere looked as pristine as if intelligent beings had never set foot on it. She knew there had been only a little more than 100 Namekians even before Vegeta's rampage, but that number hadn't seemed real to her before. She felt like she could fly for months and never encounter another sentient being. But in the end, with her newfound power pouring out of her, it only took her an hour to reach the village. Hello, she said once she landed. Several children ran to meet her, and she smiled at them as they tugged at her dress and chorused question after question. A tall, thin man ran up after them, apologizing profusely. I'm so sorry. Kaori. Miru. Bana. Stop pestering her. Is Abalon here? She asked as the trio of children reluctantly behaved themselves. The man nodded, guiding them back to their chores. He's in the big house. I can take you there. Kaori, stop pulling your brother's antennae, I've told you 1,000 times. The little ones properly disciplined and finally behaving, the Namekian led the way. I'm Tsumu, he said, dusting a small handprint made of dirt from his smock. I'm the teacher here. I promise they're usually better behaved. He smiled deprecatingly, tugging nervously at his antennae. Gine shook her head. They seem very sweet. I have 2 of my own, and they were both quite the handful when they were small. Yours will turn out just fine. Sumu smiled gratefully. He opened the door to the biggest structure in the village and led her inside, where an older Namekian sat in deep conversation with 2 others, warriors by the looks of them, muscular and one of them still breathing hard from exertion. Abalon looked up when they entered. Greetings, he said, standing. His tone was warm, but his face looked pinched. I'm afraid you've caught us at a bad time. Sumu, gather the children and bring them here, we've just had some terrible news. Actually, Gine had a momentary sense of unreality. This would normally be the point when Selipa or Panbukin would say something like, I'm even worse news, and shoot the old man's head off. She blinked and shook herself. I'm here to tell you to bring everyone to the Grand Elder's house. There's something even worse coming and you must evacuate. Abalon clenched his fingers around his staff, his thumb worrying the smooth wood. After a moment he turned to the warriors. Tilas, go to Tsuburi's and tell him everything. Argo, can you still fly? I know you're tired, but you must get to Lien's. There are others already spreading the word, Gine told them. Please, get everyone to the Grand Elder, we don't have much time. The one called Argo stood. He was nearly 7 feet tall and his neck was bigger around than Gine's waist. He was drenched in sweat and there was blood staining his clothes that did not seem to be his. You have a tail, he said, pointing at it. The one that slaughtered Suno's village had a tail just like that one. Belatedly she wrapped it around her waist, but it was too late. The others all took a step back from her, murmuring, and she swallowed a growl of frustration and turned back to the elder. You're Abalon, right? Chi told me Bana liked her dress. I'm just trying to help you, please listen to me. The other warrior, Tilas, glanced at Abalon. The boy looking for the dragon balls had a tail as well. That's Gohan, my grandson, Gine said desperately. He told me you gave him a riddle and he couldn't solve it, but Bulma did. That's why you gave them the Dragon Ball. Sumu stepped forward. Argo, you've always been paranoid, even when you were a kid, he said. She clearly means us no harm. I think we should listen to her. All of them looked at Abalon, who was still looking at Gine. I was just informed that a scion attacked and slaughtered 2 villages, he said. There has not been bloodshed like that on this planet since its history began to be recorded. Now you, also a scion, tell me something even worse is coming. 3, Gine said wretchedly. She wished for the umpteenth time she was really and truly an Earth woman. 3 villages were slaughtered, and if you don't get everyone off this planet right now the rest of you are going to meet the same fate. Argo drew himself up to his full height. Was that a threat? Gine lost her temper. No, you stupid slug, I'm trying to warn you. Something terrible is coming and if you don't all go to the Grand Elders right now I will drag you there myself. Over my dead body. Argo launched himself at Gine, the wild light of battle in his eyes. He was strong. In Frisia's army he would be a mid-level fighter easily. But to Gine he was moving in slow motion. Gently she parried his strike and pulled him off balance, nearly throwing him to the ground. Then she righted him again and held his arm in a joint lock, using only enough pressure to tell him not to move. It will be your dead body if you don't get moving. She released him and stepped back, her intention clear, I won't hurt you, but you can't hurt me. Argo, she did nothing to deserve that, Tila said sharply. Argo snarled. Then tears began running down his face. I held malice as he died, he cried. He said the scion didn't even want anything. Just chased them around for sport. Let them run and used them for target practice. He choked. And the children. He lost himself to tears. Gine's heart beat sideways for several seconds. Sumu stepped around her and gently put his arms around Argo's massive shoulders. All she's asking us to do is go to the Grand Elders, he said softly. I think that's what we should be doing anyway, don't you? He led him away, and Tilas stepped up to Gine. I'm sorry about him. No, it's alright, she said. I fought the scion that did this earlier and I let him go. I wish now I hadn't been so merciful. No, Tilas demurred. Mercy is never the wrong choice. How can you say that? Gine said, shocked. You heard what he did to your people. You should want him dead. The warrior grimaced. Perhaps. Certainly, if I ever meet him in battle I will feel no remorse in seeking to end his life. But if you had killed him when you had the option to spare him, then you would have become a person who killed when you did not have to, and I wouldn't wish that fate on anyone. Gine felt almost sick. For the first time she understood when Science spoke of weakness making them feel ill. This easy forgiveness was hard to bear. Let's go, was all she said. The crowd around the Grand Elder's house was large, in that it was larger than the building could contain. But for a gathering of every single member of an entire species it was pitifully small. The Grand Elder could no longer leave his chair, and indeed he had told Gine and the others that he was not long for this world. But he still wanted to address his children, so Yamcha, Krillin, Kakarot and Nail had carefully carried him, chair and all, outside. The smaller children gasped in delight to see their parent, and crowded around him, eager but respectful. The older Namekians smiled as well, but theirs were tinged with worry. Most of the elders only looked grim. My children, the Grand Elder said, and everyone, even the youngest, a tiny 6-month-old named Mulin, quieted. It does my heart good to see you all, but unfortunately the occasion of our gathering is a solemn one. A great evil is approaching our world, and our only hope for survival is to put our trust in our new friends. You must leave with them, and perhaps live with them for a time, until it is safe to return. But what about you? One of the Namekians said. Gine and the other Earthlings were standing on the periphery of the crowd, silent and awkward. Grand Elder, aren't you coming with us? Of course he's coming with us. I don't understand, what great evil? Nail called out sternly. Quiet everyone. When the noise died down, the Grand Elder continued. My children, this is a hard thing I ask of you. We have not left our homeworld en masse before. But you all know the stories of those sent out into the universe before the Great Calamity, and the Earthlings have brought me news that one of them survived. The son of Katats waits for you on Earth. A surprised and hopeful murmur rippled through the crowd. Bulma took that as her cue and began explaining the evacuation plan. It was a good plan, straightforward and orderly. Naturally chaos ensued. Children ran up and down the gangplank, the fighters pleaded with Nail to let them stay and help, each village elder wanted a private word with the Grand Elder, and Chi-Chi kept calling out for Gohan, who was probably off pouting at not having been able to help Den convince anyone to let him stay. Gine watched it all and felt tired. Finally, after what seemed like hours, all the children had been rounded up, the fighters had been pacified and the elders had spoken, and every Namekian except for the Grand Elder and Nail were aboard. Bulma and Yamcha waved to everyone from the gangplank, which slowly closed. The engines roared, the ship lifted into the air, rising ever higher into the sky until it was smothered by cloud cover and disappeared. And then, they were all alone. Gine had been on empty planets before, of course, but this was different, and not just because the ground wasn't littered with corpses. She reached out with her senses to encompass the whole globe and found only silence. Even the low background glow of less intelligent life felt more subdued. Namek had been lonely before, but now it was eerie. Mournful. Haunted. Gohan. Chi-Chi shouted. I'm not kidding, young man, you stop hiding your energy this instant. Gine snapped out of her morbid imaginings and focused. There was the Grand Elder, less bright but far warmer than any of the others, the white-hot spear that was Nail, Kakarot's familiar pillar of flame, Krillin's wry flickering, Chi-Chi's fierce bonfire. Gohan's eager, happy glow was nowhere to be found. That's weird, Kakarot said, frowning. Where'd he go? He must really be mad at you, Krillin chuckled. He's got more sense than to wander off on a strange planet by himself with Frieza coming, no matter how mad he is, Chi-Chi snapped. Something must have happened to him. We have to look for him. No one suggested that Chi-Chi was overreacting. With grim expressions and without much discussion, everyone split up and went looking. Gine flew toward the one other power she had sensed, the billowing storm cloud shot through with dark lightning that she prayed had nothing to do with Gohan's absence. She saw Vegeta's handiwork long before she saw him, shattered mountains, craters filling with water, broken trees and blackened grass. As she flew she began to hear the shriek and whine of energy being expended, the explosion of ki blasts and, eventually, the mad cackling of someone completely undone with power. Have you come to fight me or ask for my help? Vegeta said without turning around. He leveled another mountain as she watched. Either way, I'm not interested. Gine breathed slowly. Have you seen Gohan? Now he did turn around, one eyebrow raised. And which one is that? She grit her teeth. The boy. This seemed to amuse him. Lost him, have you? Gine imagined taking him by the ears and shaking him so hard they tore right off the sides of his stupid head. Have you seen him? I have. He inspected an imaginary spot of dirt under the nails of his once crushed hand, drawing out the moment and Gine's patience to near breaking. I saw him and his little green friend a few hours ago, but I neither know nor do I care what's happened to them since. Did you do anything to them? She hissed. Vegeta feigned wounded indignation. Of course not. I gave my word I wouldn't harm anyone until after Frieza is dealt with. And I trust you about as far as I can. Gine laughed. Well, as far as you can throw me. The hard little smile that curled its way across Vegeta's face might have given her goosebumps once. You would be wise to remember that my promise has an expiration date. I'm not worried about you, Prince, Gine scoffed. If we're somehow still alive after all this, you are going to be the least of my worries. But he only continued to smile. You'll be changing your tune once you understand the levels of power that Slug has unlocked in me. I have finally become that which Frieza most feared. You're going to live just long enough to see the greatest triumph of our race come to fruition. Cherish it, woman. Disgusted, and certain that if Vegeta did have anything to do with Gohan's disappearance he would be gloating about that instead of making vague threats, Gine turned and flew away. If I see the boy again I'll give him your regards, Vegeta called after her, and it was a very near thing not to turn around and vaporize him on the spot. In theory Gohan knew that Namek was a tidally locked planet that orbited a trinary star system at just the right distance that the day side wasn't too hot and the night side wasn't too cold. It was a fascinatingly delicate arrangement, and it made him even more excited to get to calculus than he already was, to better understand the orbital mechanics. In practice, the fact that he'd been here for almost 2 weeks and hadn't seen a single sunset was disconcerting to say the least. Part of the strangeness was in how easy it was to forget there was anything strange. It would sneak up on him, a jolt of wrongness upon suddenly realizing dinner had been hours ago but it was still light out. He and Den had been walking for nearly half a day but the shadows still lay as they had when they set out. It made it seem like they weren't making any progress at all. Den had come to him in the midst of the evacuation, distraught. Gohan, Muri said no. He doesn't understand. And the Grand Elder won't countermand him, he says as my caretaker I have to listen to him. He clutched Gohan's hands, nearly in tears, and Gohan squeezed back. Then we'll do it. It'll work, I promise. And just as they had planned, Den got onto the big ship bound for Earth. He made a point of checking in with Muri, and then told him he was going to go sit next to Cargo. But once he found Cargo he only said he was going to go sit with Muri. And then he'd slipped off the ship, easily missed in the confusion, and he and Gohan had first walked, then ran, and then walked again, away from the camp and into the wilds. What do you think? Gohan said as they entered a system of ravines that split the landscape like a natural maze. I found this place while I was flying to Lien's. You can hide out here until it's too late to turn the ship around, and then I'll come get you. I think a day should do it. Okay, Den said, but when Gohan turned to leave Den pulled at his hand again. Gohan. I'm scared. Do you want to go back? Gohan asked worriedly. The ship hasn't left yet. There's still time if you want to leave with the others. But Den shook his head. No. I want to stay. That's not what I meant. He bit his lip. Vegeta is still out there. What if he finds me? He won't, Gohan assured him. He can't sense energy, and even if he could, as long as you don't fly, you'll basically be invisible. Just as he said it, he felt the hackle-raising feeling of a dark, evil ki, coming in fast. He heard someone land with a thud just outside the ravine entrance, and then felt them move unerringly down the ravine right toward them. Gohan shoved Den down a side path just as Vegeta came into view. He kept his eyes on the prince, resisting the powerful urge to glance at Den, who was still in his peripheral vision. Vegeta stalked toward him, and Gohan, even though it was the last thing he wanted to do, took a step forward to meet him. What do you want? He demanded. Vegeta laughed. You're a feisty brat. You must get that from your mother. Kakarot turned out to be nothing but a pathetic milksop. He wasn't so pathetic that he couldn't beat you, Gohan thought. What do you want? He repeated. I just wanted to see who was skulking around down here. Vegeta was smiling, in fact hadn't stopped smiling since he'd come into view. He was in a spectacular mood. Gohan didn't know if that meant violence was less likely, or more. I picked up that useful little technique you Earthlings use and I've been improving on it. Did you know I was over a mile from here when I sensed you? He seemed proud of himself. Good for you, Gohan said, and for the first time Vegeta's smile fell flat. You really do have a little mouth on you, don't you? He took a sharp step forward and Gohan flinched, the urge to back up fighting with the need to keep Den hidden. Vegeta reached toward him and Gohan clenched his fists but held his ground. Don't worry, Vegeta said softly, giving his head a pat. I gave my word not to harm anyone until Frieza gets here. You don't need to be frightened of me, boy. At least, he grinned again, fingering Gohan's silky, unscion-like hair, not for now. He released Gohan's hair and took a step back, studying him. Once this is all over, though, I'm going to teach you some manners. Your upbringing was clearly deficient. But it's not too late. I could raise you into a proper scion. I'd need to get rid of your father first, of course, maybe your mother too. Gohan felt his teeth chattering and realized his hair was standing straight up with all the energy pouring off him. He tamped down on it as best he couldn't afford to get in a fight right now. But Vegeta merely laughed. See? You have spirit. I can work with that. Look forward to it, boy. He gave a lazy salute and walked away, taking to the air as soon as he exited the ravine. Gohan sagged, leaking air like a balloon. Dend? He staggered back a step. Dend was still lying where he'd shoved him, frozen in place. At hearing his name he lifted his head out of the dirt ever so slightly to look at Gohan. It's okay, Gohan said, sitting down on the ground with a thump. He's gone. Dend flopped over, groaning in relief. That was so scary. Change of plans, Gohan said firmly. I'm staying with you while we wait. But, Dend struggled to sit up. Won't your family wonder where you are? It doesn't matter, Gohan said. I can't leave you by yourself with Vegeta here, and we can't go back, not yet. But we didn't bring any food. That's okay, Gohan said. I checked with Bulma and she said it's safe to eat the animals here. Dend made a face. As long as I don't have to watch you do it. Don't worry, I'll be neat about it, Gohan said. He had his suspicions that Namekians were also capable of eating solid foods, perhaps even meat, what with those incisors, but now didn't seem like the time to bring it up. I am glad you'll be with me, though, Dend admitted, picking at the cuffs of his sleeves. Even if Frieza doesn't. Well, once this is all over and you go home, I don't know if I'll ever see you again. You will, Gohan said with confidence he wasn't entirely sure was justified. Just this once, though, he left logic in favor of hope. We made it here once, we can make it here again. If our elders don't kill us for making them worry, Den said dolefully. Gohan laughed, surprised at how much better even that short chuckle made him feel. I'm sure they'll let us visit each other once they use the Dragon Balls to wish us back. It was Den's turn to laugh. They took turns telling each other jokes, trying to outdo each other, until Gohan fell asleep with his head in Den's lap, the lack of sunsets having left him unaware that he'd been awake for almost 28 hours. Den, bravely, let him sleep, but his ears twitched at every sound for the entire 10 hours Gohan slept. You would be wise to remember that my promise has an expiration date. I'm not worried about you, Prince, Gine scoffed. If we're somehow still alive after all this, you're going to be the least of my worries. But he only continued to smile. You'll be changing your tune once you understand the levels of power that Slug has unlocked in me. I have finally become that which Frieza most feared. You're going to live just long enough to see the greatest triumph of our race come to fruition. Cherish it, woman. Disgusted, and certain that if Vegeta did have anything to do with Gohan's disappearance he would be gloating about that instead of making vague threats, Gine turned and flew away. If I see the boy again I'll give him your regards, Vegeta called after her, and it was a very near thing not to turn around and vaporize him on the spot. In theory Gohan knew that Namek was a tidally locked planet that orbited a trinary star system at just the right distance that the day side wasn't too hot and the night side wasn't too cold. It was a fascinatingly delicate arrangement, and it made him even more excited to get to calculus than he already was, to better understand the orbital mechanics. In practice, the fact that he'd been here for almost 2 weeks and hadn't seen a single sunset was disconcerting to say the least. Part of the strangeness was in how easy it was to forget there was anything strange. It would sneak up on him, a jolt of wrongness upon suddenly realizing dinner had been hours ago but it was still light out. He and Den had been walking for nearly half a day but the shadows still lay as they had when they set out. It made it seem like they weren't making any progress at all. Den had come to him in the midst of the evacuation, distraught. Gohan, Muri said no. He doesn't understand. And the Grand Elder won't countermand him. He says as my caretaker I have to listen to him. He clutched Gohan's hands, nearly in tears, and Gohan squeezed back. Then we'll do it. It'll work, I promise. And just as they had planned, Dend got onto the big ship bound for Earth. He made a point of checking in with Muri, and then told him he was going to go sit next to Cargo. But once he found Cargo he only said he was going to go sit with Muri. And then he'd slipped off the ship, easily missed in the confusion, and he and Gohan had first walked, then ran, and then walked again, away from the camp and into the wilds. What do you think? Gohan said as they entered a system of ravines that split the landscape like a natural maze. I found this place while I was flying to Lien's. You can hide out here until it's too late to turn the ship around, and then I'll come get you. I think a day should do it. Okay, Dend said, but when Gohan turned to leave Dend pulled at his hand again. Gohan. I'm scared. Do you want to go back? Gohan asked worriedly. The ship hasn't left yet. There's still time if you want to leave with the others. But Dend shook his head. No. I want to stay. That's not what I meant. He bit his lip. Vegeta is still out there. What if he finds me? He won't, Gohan assured him. He can't sense energy, and even if he could, as long as you don't fly, you'll basically be invisible. Just as he said it, he felt the hackle-raising feeling of a dark, evil ki, coming in fast. He heard someone land with a thud just outside the ravine entrance, and then felt them move unerringly down the ravine right toward them. Gohan shoved Den down a side path just as Vegeta came into view. He kept his eyes on the prince, resisting the powerful urge to glance at Dend, who was still in his peripheral vision. Vegeta stalked toward him, and Gohan, even though it was the last thing he wanted to do, took a step forward to meet him. What do you want? He demanded. Vegeta laughed. You're a feisty brat. You must get that from your mother. Kakarot turned out to be nothing but a pathetic milksop. He wasn't so pathetic that he couldn't beat you, Gohan thought. What do you want? He repeated. I just wanted to see who was skulking around down here. Vegeta was smiling, in fact hadn't stopped smiling since he'd come into view. He was in a spectacular mood. Gohan didn't know if that meant violence was less likely, or more. I picked up that useful little technique you Earthlings use and I've been improving on it. Did you know I was over a mile from here when I sensed you? He seemed proud of himself. Good for you, Gohan said, and for the first time Vegeta's smile fell flat. You really do have a little mouth on you, don't you? He took a sharp step forward and Gohan flinched, the urge to back up fighting with the need to keep Den hidden. Vegeta reached toward him and Gohan clenched his fists but held his ground. Don't worry, Vegeta said softly, giving his head a pat. I gave my word not to harm anyone until Frieza gets here. You don't need to be frightened of me, boy. At least, he grinned again, fingering Gohan's silky, unscion-like hair, not for now. He released Gohan's hair and took a step back, studying him. Once this is all over, though, I'm going to teach you some manners. Your upbringing was clearly deficient. But it's not too late. I could raise you into a proper scion. I'd need to get rid of your father first, of course, maybe your mother too. Gohan felt his teeth chattering and realized his hair was standing straight up with all the energy pouring off him. He tamped down on it as best he couldn't afford to get in a fight right now. But Vegeta merely laughed. See? You have spirit. I can work with that. Look forward to it, boy. He gave a lazy salute and walked away, taking to the air as soon as he exited the ravine. Gohan sagged, leaking air like a balloon. Dend? He staggered back a step. Dend was still lying where he'd shoved him, frozen in place. At hearing his name he lifted his head out of the dirt ever so slightly to look at Gohan. It's okay, Gohan said, sitting down on the ground with a thump. He's gone. Dend flopped over, groaning in relief. That was so scary. Change of plans, Gohan said firmly. I'm staying with you while we wait. But, Dend struggled to sit up. Won't your family wonder where you are? It doesn't matter, Gohan said. I can't leave you by yourself with Vegeta here, and we can't go back, not yet. But we didn't bring any food. That's okay, Gohan said. I checked with Bulma and she said it's safe to eat the animals here. Dend made a face. As long as I don't have to watch you do it. Don't worry, I'll be neat about it, Gohan said. He had his suspicions that Namekians were also capable of eating solid foods, perhaps even meat, what with those incisors, but now didn't seem like the time to bring it up. I am glad you'll be with me, though, Den admitted, picking at the cuffs of his sleeves. Even if Frisia doesn't. Well, once this is all over and you go home, I don't know if I'll ever see you again. You will, Gohan said with confidence he wasn't entirely sure was justified. Just this once, though, he left logic in favor of hope. We made it here once, we can make it here again. If our elders don't kill us for making them worry, Den said dolefully. Gohan laughed, surprised at how much better even that short chuckle made him feel. I'm sure they'll let us visit each other once they use the Dragon Balls to wish us back. It was Den's turn to laugh. They took turns telling each other jokes, trying to outdo each other, until Gohan fell asleep with his head in Den's lap, the lack of sunsets having left him unaware that he'd been awake for almost 28 hours. Den, bravely, let him sleep, but his ears twitched at every sound for the entire 10 hours Gohan slept. Kakarot was disappointed. From the air he could see Gohan fast asleep on Den's lap. Sure, Den was awake, but he wasn't a warrior. What if Vegeta came by? Had they been planning on staying out here until Frisia came? What had Gohan been thinking? Kakarot landed with a deliberate thud, ready to scold his son as he had never needed to in his life. But Gohan surged to his feet before the noise of his landing had even died away. Still half asleep, the boy's hands filled with ki, his feet wide in a ready, protective stance. Though imperfect, Gohan's guard was solid enough that it could not be easily ignored. The scolding died on Kakarot's lips. Blinking blearily, Gohan's stance eased as he realized who had landed in front of him. Hi, Dad, he began, but Kakarot made as though to grab Den, and quick as thought Gohan swatted his hand away with an arm block. Now Kakarot reached for Gohan, and Gohan batted him away with his other hand, expression turning grim. Kakarot slid inside Gohan's guard, parting his ki like water, and in Gohan's sudden panic he raised his hands and shot a ki blast straight at Kakarot's chest. It was warm, but not scalding. Gohan had put all his intention into force rather than heat, and Kakarot felt himself being pushed back. He could have resisted, but he was surprised at how much effort it would have taken. Instead, he let himself be pushed, then rushed forward again, only to find Gohan leaping at him, harrying him with kicks to his head and shoulders. He blocked them, grabbing Gohan's foot at an opportune moment and swinging him down at the ground, softening the blow as much as he could. That proved to be a mistake. Gohan stopped himself inches from the ground and wrenched his foot out of Kakarot's hand, spinning sideways in midair and using his momentum to slide tackle Kakarot's legs out from under him. Kakarot landed flat on his back. Immediately he tensed to flip to his feet again, but Gohan had already leaped into the air and was coming down with both feet to stomp him into the dust. Kakarot had two choices, as he saw it: let his son bring the full weight of his body and ki down on his stomach and try to bear it, a painful prospect, or try to stop him with a ki blast, one that would need to be strong enough to actually hurt him, since going easy on him did not seem to be working. Unsure of exactly how durable his son was, or his stomach, for that matter, Gohan had gotten strong. Kakarot, as he often did, chose option C. He flared briefly into Kaioken and rolled out of the way, hopping to his feet as soon as he was clear. Stop! Den was sobbing, kneeling on the ground in terror. Please, stop. I'll go back, just stop fighting. Kakarot ignored him. He looked at Gohan, chest heaving. Why is this so important to you? He asked. Gohan gritted his teeth against the tears that began to fall. Because I couldn't protect anyone. When Nappa was going to kill Mom, I couldn't do anything to stop him. He would have killed her if you hadn't saved her. And then Vegeta came, and he fought us and he killed all those people and I still wasn't strong enough. Gohan hiccuped a sob, and then angrily scrubbed his tears away. Den just wants to protect his family, and I know exactly how he feels. Even if all I can do is make sure he can help, I have to do it. He glowered at his father, his hands clenching into tiny fists. And I won't let you stop me. When Kakarot had handed Gohan to Gine before heading off to the world of the dead, his son had been little more than a baby. Only a year later, this boy in front of him was practically another person entirely. It was one thing to hear about Gohan's efforts on the battlefield, after the fact and second hand. It was quite another to witness his son's indomitable spirit, and have it leveled at him. Your mom's gonna kill you, you know, he said with a grin. Gohan's face slowly lit up as he realized what this meant. You won't tell them where we are? No, because I'm staying here with you. Kakarot folded his arms sternly over his chest. If Vegeta had been the one to find you, he wouldn't have gone so easy on you. He did find us, Gohan told him as he helped Den to stand. The young Namekian looked rapidly back and forth between them, eyes wide. Kakarot uncrossed his arms in alarm. What did he do? Nothing, Gohan said, but his tone implied it had been an unpleasant nothing. He promised he wouldn't hurt anybody, and he's keeping his word. Kakarot gave a surprised grunt. Gohan took Den's hand and held it, but he was frowning at the ground. Dad, he said. Kakarot tilted his head. Gohan's frown deepened. Grandma always said Scions were bad, but she said you and me were different because we were raised on Earth. Yeah, Kakarot said warily. But I started wondering. Grandma wasn't raised on Earth. She was raised with other Scions. Why is she the only one that's different? Kakarot and Den looked at each other. It was not an exchange between two people sharing a moment of silent understanding. Both were looking at the other for clarification, context. Neither of them found what they were looking for. Kakarot looked back at his son, frowning as well. Well, that's because your grandma's special, he said. Gohan looked up finally, about to say something that died on his lips as soon as he met his father's eyes. He shook his head minutely, then tried again. Yes, but why? If Scions are inherently bad, then it shouldn't matter how they're raised. And if they're bad because of how they're raised, why is Grandma the only good one when she was raised the same way? The feeling that this boy wasn't quite the son he remembered intensified. Kakarot took in a breath to speak, but someone landed near them and they all turned to look. What, are we playing sardines? Krillin chuckled. Chi-Chi's going to be so mad. She was, and Gine was hardly less angry, but she let Chi-Chi do the yelling. Gohan took his medicine like a man, head bowed but shoulders straight as his mother ripped him a new one. Then it was Kakarot's turn, and he was sheepish and tried to wiggle out of it and got even more of a mouthful than his son had. Then she turned to Dend, and her fire banked somewhat. She stood, arms folded, and studied him for a moment before sighing. I'm not your parent, so I can't scold you, she said. But you're my son's friend and I worry about your safety. She tilted her head to look at the Grand Elder, with whom she had formed an unexpected bond in the short time their children had been missing. Dend, he said softly. Come here, my son. As bravely as Gohan, Dend stepped up beside his father. The Grand Elder regarded him impassively for a long moment, long enough that Dend grew antsy, began fidgeting, then burst out. Grand Elder, why did you unlock my healing powers if not to have me use them when it's important? I know hiding was wrong, but I don't care. I'd do it again. He thrust out his chin defiantly, but only for a moment. He seemed to grow embarrassed and tucked his chin against his chest, staring at the floor, but he did not retract his words. Nail coughed and turned his face away. Gine thought he might be smiling. The Grand Elder did smile, though it was sad. You are correct, Dend. To possess gifts and not use them is selfishness. Forgive me my selfishness for wanting you safe. Tears welled up and spilled over Dend's cheeks almost instantly. He floated up and grabbed the Grand Elder's hand in his tiny one. I forgive you, he warbled. I'm sorry I made you worry. Please forgive me. The Grand Elder forgave him. Gine slid her eyes away from this effusion of familial love and saw Gohan leaning against his mother's hip, her fingers absently combing his hair. Her eyes moved to Kakarot, who was looking at his wife and son with a pleased, proprietary air. The three of them formed a beautiful, perfect tableau, but a closed one. Loneliness, black and airless, welled up inside her as quickly as Den's tears, until she was choking on it. Where was her baby, leaning against her side, hair under her fingers? When had he gotten so old? When had she? And then there he was. Kakarot had sidled up to her while she'd been distracted by despair and was grinning at her sideways. He was taller than her but still somehow gave the impression that he thought she was bigger than him, like a dog that hasn't realized it's not a puppy anymore. Ain't he cute, he murmured. You think the old-timer would let us borrow him? Gohan's never had a best friend before. His thoughts mirrored hers from a few days ago so closely that her ugly ruminations broke like a plate and vanished. She laughed, and reached up and dug her fingers into his hair. You're always going to be my baby, she said. I know, he said, smiling, but the words didn't make her as happy as she thought they would. They all felt it, all at once. It was hours later, after a meal and some quiet, subdued conversation. All that had been left to do was wait and stew in terrified boredom, but now it seemed the wait was over. Krillin gave a surprised cry and leapt to his feet. Kakarot sucked in a breath, and Gohan held Den's hand tighter. Even the Grand Elder was frowning. Chi looked the fiercest, staring up at the sky with her hands balled into fists. That's him, she said. That's the one that killed all the scions. Gine swallowed around the ashes in her mouth. Yes. Chi-Chi's voice was steel. Well, he ain't going to kill any more. Gohan, get Den to safety, Kakarot ordered. Alright. He grabbed Den's hand and pulled him out of the building, but before any of them could move they heard both boys cry out. All of them rushed outside to find two figures, each holding a struggling child. Zarbon tossed a lock of hair out of his face and smiled politely. If you would all be so kind as to inform us of the whereabouts of the Scion Prince Vegeta, I'm sure we can find a way to bring this to a peaceful conclusion. Dodoria rearranged Den in his arms like a bag of groceries. What he said. Gohan. Chi cried. Is one of them Frieza? Kakarot asked Gine in a low growl. Gine shook her head. Zarbon and Dodoria. They're his right-hand men, so he can't be far behind. Kakarot scoffed. They don't look that strong. Bardock told me that one can transform. Gine nodded at Zarbon. So be careful. Dodoria cocked his head. Bardock? She saw him notice the tail around her waist. Hey, you're a scion. How come you're not dead? Gine felt black satisfaction as she said, Frieza didn't get all of us. No. Dodoria shook his head like he was trying to dislodge a fly. I already killed all of Bardock's crew before that. He chuckled. Probably why he went all crazy at the end. Gine's ears began to ring. She whispered, what? Dodoria counted on his fingers. Yeah, let's see, there was the chick, and that big fat guy, Zarbon snorted, the one with the scars and the other one. Celipa, Gine whispered. Panbukin. Totapo. Toma. Yeah, that was their names. I killed them all dead. How'd I miss you? Celipa, laughing. Don't be stupid, girl. I don't want your sloppy seconds. I don't want you here at all. Totapo, silently sharing his food. Panbukin, checking her power level on his scouter every few seconds to see if it had changed and laughing when it hadn't. Toma, looking worried. You know people are starting to talk. Don't you think you should do him a favor and just leave? Bardock. Bloodied and serious, standing in the kitchen, telling her to get their son to safety. Had he known his crew was dead at that point? Had he been running on fumes and grief, or had he died not knowing their fate? Ah, well, guess I'll get to it now, Dodoria said. I wonder how many more survived. Bardock certainly didn't. Zarbon laughed. Frieza. Dodoria mocked. What did he think he was gonna do, kill Frieza by himself? They both laughed. The ringing in Gine's ears grew louder. Gently, she eased Gohan out of Zarbon's arms, plucked Den from Dodoria's, set them down next to Kakarot, and then positioned herself between the two lackeys, all before anyone had even realized she'd moved. She closed her eyes, feeling where they were, feeling how weak they were, and savored it, just for a moment. Then she thrust out her hands, one to either side. This is for Bardock, she whispered, and vaporized them. They'd been washing up after a purge. It had been just the two of them, tired, scrubbing the blood and dust and memories away with mechanical efficiency. She'd glanced at him, seen the boot-shaped imprint on his upper thigh, the bald patch at the base of his tail, and knew instantly what they meant. Who they meant. Zarbon and Dodoria took special pleasure in tormenting scions, and Bardock was the strongest scion who wasn't royalty. He took it, because he was strong enough to, because what else could he do? It was just the way things were. But today the marks made Gine want to retch. Without thinking she placed her tail over the bruise on his thigh. She was not surprised when he smacked it away, but she was surprised when he shoved her against the wall and stalked out, still streaming with water and blood. It had been her own fault, of course. Acknowledging weakness in someone you respected was simply not done. She'd hurt him, worse than whatever Zarbon and Dodoria had done. What else could she have expected? He'd been ever so slightly more tender with her the next time they coupled. It was all the apology she'd expected. It was all the apology he'd been capable of making. She'd forgiven him, of course. But from then on she counted the bruises. It was the only thing she could do. Gine lowered her arms, breathing in the scent of ozone and dust. There was no trace of Zarbon or Dodoria. Just black scorch marks on the grass to either side of her. She exhaled slowly, years of memories escaping along with the air. Setting her face in a smile she did not mean, she turned to look at Kakarot, and the blood froze in her veins. Sitting in a floating chair, high atop the Grand Elder's house, was Frisia. He smiled when Gine caught sight of him. I suppose you think you're terribly clever. He floated down from the roof until he was level with the ground. Nail bristled where he stood in the doorway, but Frisia kept his eyes on Gine. You must have known you couldn't hide Vegeta from me forever. All I wanted was to take him and leave, no bloodshed necessary. But what did I expect? His smile practically glittered. Scions think all bloodshed is necessary. No one asked if this was Frisia. I am curious, though, Frisia went on, still looking hard at Gine. She quailed under his nightmare gaze. You just took out my 2 right-hand men. But I would know if there was still a scion with battle power like that running around the galaxy. Where have you been hiding, woman? Gine had only ever seen Frisia one time, during a planet-wide review. She'd been unfortunate enough to be in the second row as he walked past, inspecting his troops with a condescending smile. Certainly something about him had given her the shivers, but he'd taken no notice of her, a little low-class nobody standing in formation. His cruelty was widely known, but to her, at the time, he'd seemed no different than the scions who killed in his name. Reaching out with her senses now, she felt a screeching static in her brain, a crawling horror that dwarfed Vegeta and his petty narcissism, dwarfed even the Demon King and his delight in the suffering of others. This being before her had disintegrated a planet full of people and had probably done so laughing. It seemed wrong that he could use language, speak words with politeness and manners. A monster should gnash its teeth and snarl wordlessly, not sit there and converse with people as though it was anything like them. Her rising fear triggered Gine to take a deep breath, automatically centering herself and settling her energy as Cammy had taught her, all those years ago. Another breath, and she was calm, fully present in the moment, aware and alert, but not frantic. She could feel the energy of those around her, her friends, her family, her allies, even the squadron of Frisia soldiers milling around behind the house. She felt Frisia, and it was like missing a step at the top of the stairs. Frisia was weaker than her. As a thought it wouldn't fit in her brain. As a sentence she couldn't put the words in that order. But in her gut, she felt it, strange and triumphant. She could take him. No answer. Frisia was saying. Very well. Dispatch them, but leave the scion woman. Troops flooded over the roof of the house, and Gine let go the feeling of Frisia's ki to focus on the combatants in front of her. Under orders not to injure her, they avoided her, aiming at Kakarot, Krillin, Nail, Chi-Chi, and the children. Gohan covered Dend as best he could, but one boy facing 30 Frisia soldiers was simply not enough on his own. Chi-Chi, full of wrath, spun her energy scythe in wide swathes, shearing down 5 soldiers headed for Gohan in one go. Before her scythe had spun a single circuit, she'd kicked 2 more cretins into unconsciousness and jabbed another in the jaw, sending him staggering. Krillin called up his Kienzan, cutting circles of carnage through the crowd. Kakarot waded through wads of soldiers, trying to find his way to Frisia but getting sidetracked as a small horde surrounded the house and Nail found himself overwhelmed. Kakarot kicked several soldiers out of the way and slew several more in a single blow, carving a path to give Nail breathing room in which to deal death blows of his own. Gohan picked off soldiers one at a time from the small circle of cover his mother and Krillin were creating for him, one hand curled protectively around his friend and the other aimed outward, his power potent enough to prove more than a match for most of Frisia's men. In minutes they had whittled down their numbers to only a handful, the strong or the cowardly. The small band huddled together near Frisia, one of them glancing back at him as though asking for further instructions. Are you deaf? Frisia snapped. I said dispatch them. But. The soldier was green with dark blue spots. Gine was fairly certain she'd served him in the mess hall once or twice. In a minute or two she might even be able to remember his name. But they're too strong. Frisia lazily pointed a finger at him and shot him dead. He looked at the rest of the troops in mild irritation. You can fight them, or you can fight me, he purred. Your choice. As one and without hesitation, the terrified group turned back to the Earthlings. Gine realized everyone was looking at her. Chi-Chi and Krillin and Gohan and Kakarot, all unwilling to commit wholesale slaughter and asking her each in their own way if there was some way out of it. Gine looked at Frisia, who was still looking back at her with mild interest, and saw in his eyes that he cared so little for the lives of his own men that he wouldn't even derive any pleasure from killing them. He wouldn't draw out their deaths or be enraged at their failure, he would simply dispatch them and move on. Being merciful was no mercy here. But before she could communicate any of this to the others, a huge ki blast lit up the area, disintegrating the soldiers and nearly taking out the Grand Elder's house. Nail stood before it and bore the brunt of the blast wave on his forearms, which blackened and burned. Frisia was obscured in a cloud of smoke, and as it cleared they could see that his chair had been charred to a crisp, along with his scouter. Standing in front of him, smiling sickeningly, was Vegeta. "Did you really come all this way just for me?" Frisia's answering smile was a bright, brittle thing. "You always did have an overinflated sense of your own importance, my dear prince. Surely you didn't think I'd simply look the other way while you openly defied me? If you're expecting the usual slap on the wrist this time, you're sadly mistaken." "You're right, Frisia," Vegeta agreed. "We're past that now. All that time spent bowing and scraping before the great Lord Frisia is finally at an end." Frisia's smile widened fractionally. "Oh. Are you finally doing it? Your little coup d'etat you've been planning for so long. I'm positively tingling with anticipation to see what you've come up with." The two of them stared at each other, their smiles thin veils over their hatred for each other. There was history here, Gine realized. Decades of servitude and abuse. If any scion deserved to kill Frisia more than any other, it was the prince. And truthfully, Gine would have been happy enough to let these two play out an end to their twisted association without interference from her, except for one thing: Vegeta wasn't strong enough. He was stronger than he had been, sure enough. The Grand Elder had seen to that. But he was still no match for Frisia. And he seemed to be entirely unaware of it. "You killed the scions, but you left me alive. Surely you must have known how foolish that was, Frisia. Your desire to play with your food is about to be the death of you." He spread his arms in a grand gesture. "You see standing before you none other than the legendary Super Saiyan." Frisia stared nonplussed. Then he laughed, a high, horrible sound that went on too long. "Oh, I get it now. You're not setting a plan in motion. You've simply gone insane. How sad. I was hoping for something more entertaining." Vegeta clenched his fists. "You want entertainment? I'll give you entertainment." He rushed him, and Frisia caught his fist inches from his face, looking, for the first time, less than perfectly composed. Vegeta swung his other fist and Frisia caught that too, his arm shaking with the effort of holding it back. "You see." Vegeta grunted. His teeth were bare in an exultant grimace. "I am the legend." They sprang apart, Frisia actually sweating. He was frowning ferociously at Vegeta. So you weren't entirely bluffing." "I've got more than that up my sleeve," Vegeta promised. "Prepare to meet your end, Frisia." He lunged again, the power of stars and the vengeance of millions riding on his fist. Frisia stepped out of the way, caught him by the throat, and slammed him to the ground, where he lay, motionless. Frisia sighed. "Disappointing." Frisia leaned forward and put his foot on Vegeta's head. "Are you still awake, Prince? I want you to feel every second of the agony I'm about to put you through." He twisted his foot, shoving Vegeta's face into the dirt. The prince moaned, unable to do anything about it. Frisia was ignoring the rest of them, completely focused on tormenting Vegeta. Gine felt Kakarot's eyes on her, asking her what to do. They were the only two who could stop this, and Gine wasn't sure they should. But then, as Vegeta's agonizing cries echoed across the empty landscape, Gine realized something. Tilla's words echoed in her head: "Mercy is never the wrong choice." And even now, she knew the Namekian was wrong. Vegeta was a stain on the galaxy and she would personally sleep better at night if he was no longer in it. But he was a scion, same as her, and if she stood by and did nothing while Frisia killed him, she would be no better than either of them. Gine phased forward, kicked Vegeta out of the way, and punched Frisia in the face. Completely unprepared, the tyrant pinwheeled backward through the air, crashing into a mountain a kilometer away. Vegeta groaned, but Gine ignored him. She only had a few seconds before Frisia got his wits about him and returned. Behind her, Kakarot was speaking urgently to Chi-Chi and Gohan, Nail was saying something about the Grand Elder, Den's high, frightened voice answering him. But Gine ignored them all. She could feel a laugh bubbling up in her chest that threatened to overwhelm her composure. She just decked Lord Frisia in the face. In an instant Frisia was back, rage contorting his face. "How?" he spat, his fingers going for a scouter that was no longer there. When his fingers met only air, he instead clenched his fist and stared at her with far more interest than he'd shown Vegeta. That stare would have been enough to make her knees buckle, back in the day. Now the laugh surged again and she made a strangled sound to keep it in check. Frisia nodded slowly. A fluke, he said slowly, as though convincing himself, and Gine punched him again. He was a little more prepared this time, he didn't go flying. But he staggered back several steps. As though she was following her fists, Gine pressed her advantage, harrying him with punches and kicks he could barely avoid. He had terrible form, she realized. His blocks were sloppy and his posture did nothing to center and control his energy flow. He clearly relied on his overwhelming strength to win, but that wouldn't help him now. Somehow, amazingly, she was stronger than him. Stronger than Frisia. Her. Gine felt a grin stretch across her face. She could no longer recall why she was holding back her laughter, and let it loose. She struck Frisia again and again, growing giddier and giddier with every blow. She felt distant from her body, like any moment now she would roll over in bed and wake up. Frisia's nose began to bleed. She felt her grin stretch wider. There was a kite string in her hand, and she let it go, following it up, up into the sky until she disappeared. Kakarot felt something seize up in his chest. Beside him, Chi-Chi had pressed both hands over her mouth. Even Nail and Dend, as worried as they were about the Grand Elder, had stopped to watch. His mother was laughing. He'd never heard his mother laugh like that, not once in his whole life. She was grinning hugely, her eyes wide and full of hate. Frisia was totally overwhelmed and Gine was reveling in it. Vegeta, coughing up blood, was crawling toward Dend, begging for healing. No one paid him any attention. Grandma. Gohan whispered. Kakarot pulled his son close, both of them staring at Gine as she dismantled the tyrant. He had always wondered what kind of being could destroy a world, one that had not just the power, but the inclination. He'd grown up knowing, vaguely, that he and his mother had come from another planet, and that that planet had been destroyed. Now that he was actually feeling the unutterable horror of Frisia's ki, darker and more potent than ink poured onto a blank page, he thought he understood why the Scions had all been so nasty. Compared to this, a little raping and pillaging was nothing. She tried to tell them, Gine had. How awful Scions were. He hadn't understood then. She wasn't like that. She was soft, and good, and kind. He'd been unable to wrap his mind around the idea that someone like his mother had come from monsters. But this person, wielding death in her palms, looked like she was enjoying herself. Kakarot had never wondered if his ma enjoyed fighting. It was like asking if someone enjoyed eating. But the dark delight he could see in her eyes was nothing like her usual quiet contentment, and it gave him the willies. It's no use, he heard Den sob, and he turned to see the boy exiting the house. Gohan ran to him, taking him by the hands. Nail hovered over both of them. Den sniffed and tears ran down his cheeks. The Grand Elder is dying. He says Frisia's evil energy is, he says, and I can't do anything. Dent cried, leaning his face on Gohan's shoulder. Chi-Chi lowered her hands from her face and glowered fiercely. Ma, she called. Gine and Frisia were in midair some distance away by now, and as they watched Gine kicked him viciously in the head before following it with an uppercut and then slamming both fists into his gut. She was still grinning. Chi-Chi cupped her hands around her mouth and bellowed, "Get it over with, Ma." With slow deliberateness Gine reached a hand behind her and, without taking her eyes off Frisia, shot a ki blast at the ground next to Chi-Chi. Rocks and grass exploded into the air. Gine continued with the beating as though nothing had happened. Krillin was trembling. She. Kakarot looked at his wife, dumbfounded. But Chi-Chi was glaring up at Gine, shaking with rage. How rude. She ground her teeth. I'm not giving back the tablecloth I borrowed. She turned her glare on Kakarot. The black one with red flowers? Don't give it to her, even if she asks. Kakarot did not have it in him at that moment to hold back the chuckle that escaped his lips. Nothing fazed his wife, nothing at all, and that was almost as frightening as his mother was right now. He looked back at Gine, her fists grinding into Frisia's face over and over in time to her laughter. Almost. Suddenly, Frisia halted, and held up a hand. Gine stopped her barrage, vaguely interested to see how the Emperor would plead for his life. But he wasn't surrendering. He was smiling. Not bad, he said. I'm genuinely impressed. That doesn't happen often, you know. Savor this moment, woman, for it is over. Tensing, Frisia blew the armor he was wearing into pieces. Gine cocked her head to one side, curious. Growling deep in his throat, Frisia crouched. After a moment his torso expanded to twice its size, and with it his ki jumped. Then his arms lengthened, and then his legs. Last, with a painful grunt, his head grew to match his now enormous body. Gine watched it all impassively. You should feel honored. Frisia straightened from his crouch. His voice was deeper now, and somehow even more full of malice. There aren't many who have seen this form, and even fewer who live to speak of it. Do feel free to test it out. He spread his arms invitingly, grinning a wicked grin. He was a lot stronger, Gine could tell. He was easily twice what he had been. Distantly, she expected to be worried about that, and was distantly surprised when she wasn't. He was still sloppy, still too used to having things all his own way. He would be even more devastated when she beat him like this. She couldn't wait. Gine spiraled through the air, peppering Frisia with ki blasts to pin him down. He absorbed them on an upflung forearm, shooting answering blasts with his free hand. She dodged them, spinning a lazy barrel roll and then dropping several hundred feet in an instant. While Frisia was still looking at the place she had been, Gine rushed him from the side and roundhouse kicked him in the head. She felt one of his teeth give way and she smiled. Growling, Frisia snatched at her foot, but she had already danced out of reach. With a roar he powered up a huge ki blast and flung it at her. She bent backwards to avoid it, the blast ruffling her hair as it passed overhead. That had been close. If she'd been just a little slower she would have been burnt to cinders. Frisia grinned. That was impressive, Scion. But I wonder how many more times you can pull that off. He charged her again. Gine could tell he thought the fight was nearly over. That was fine. Technically he wasn't wrong. In terms of mere power he had her beat. If she lost concentration, even for a moment, she would lose. But Gine had been in a situation like this before. She had been vastly more powerful than Demon King Piccolo, and he had still nearly won through mind games and capitalizing on her mistakes. She'd let worry for her son break her concentration, and the Demon King, as the more experienced fighter, had hardly needed more of an opening than that. This time, though, she was the more experienced fighter. This time, she would not lose concentration. No matter what. Kakarot noticed Vegeta out of the corner of his eye and forced his gaze away from the fight. The prince was crawling toward Dend, and he was finally close enough that the boy felt the need to back up. Gohan stood between them protectively. Please. Vegeta said weakly. He was clutching his side where Frisia had crushed his ribs. One of his legs was broken and dragging. He looked at Dend, who looked back with fear and disgust, then looked at Gohan, full of righteous fury, and then he turned to Kakarot. Please, have mercy. The utter balls it took for him to say those words was almost impressive. Why should we? Gohan shot back. I bet you've never showed anyone mercy in your whole life. Vegeta shook his head, still looking at Kakarot. I kept my word. I didn't harm your boy. Kakarot glanced at Gohan, who glowered helplessly. It was true. He turned back to the prince, who, he realized, had wiped the same string of blood and saliva from his mouth 4 times now. He was bleeding internally, likely dying as they watched. Kakarot looked at Dend. No. Dend shook his head violently, backing up a step even though Kakarot hadn't moved. No, I won't. Dend, Kakarot said softly. From miles away a sound like thunder bellowed over the plains and a brief flash lit the sky. Kakarot knelt so he was eye level with Dend. I know, kiddo, but we can't just leave him like this, and you're the only one who can help him. The boy shook his head again, hiding behind Gohan, who was giving his father a stricken look. Kakarot looked at Vegeta. Well, he said. Vegeta stared at him. I can't make him do anything, Vegeta. You're going to have to help yourself a little here. Faye. Vegeta spat, and looked away. My pride does not bend so easily. Let me die, then. But let me see Frisia's demise before I do. Stop talking, Vegeta, Kakarot ordered. You're just making it worse. Shut up. Vegeta coughed painfully, flecks of blood spattering the ground in front of him. You know, he killed us all, do you not? But do you know what happened after? After? In the distance Kakarot saw a huge plume of water erupt from the ocean, though which fighter had just been flung into its depths he wasn't certain. What do you mean? The day after it happened. Frisia called the 3 of us before him. Vegeta's breath hitched and Kakarot was amazed to see tears start streaming down his cheeks. We all knew what he'd done, and we were certain he was about to finish the job. But instead, he apologized for not seeing the meteor sooner. He sat there and acted sorry, and we had to forgive him. Vegeta clenched his teeth and sobbed for a moment. It went on like that for years. His cruelty was inventive and boundless. He opened one eye and glared at Kakarot. Your mother thinks she knows what he's like, but she doesn't. She can't. That's why it has to be me. Vegeta closed his eyes and sighed, and Kakarot saw belatedly the sizable puddle of blood that had been forming under his chin. He turned to Dend once more. Please, Dend, he's dying. I promise you I won't let him hurt anyone else. Dend screwed up his face in dismay. Kakarot was afraid he was going to refuse again, but then Nail was there, kneeling next to the boy with a sorrowful look. I know how you feel, little brother, he said. But I think you should help him. Not for him, he said to the look of betrayal on Den's face, but for yourself. Don't be a person who lets vengeance rule his heart. More tears dripped from Den's eyes. A fierce wind whipped around as the combatants streaked overhead, clashing again miles away. Den looked at them, and then at Vegeta, whose breathing grew shallower as they watched. The boy's antennae stretched and curled in agitation, until finally he inhaled sharply, as though bracing himself. He held up his hands, and the warm glow of healing illuminated Vegeta's body. Thank you, Den, Kakarot breathed. The boy only turned his head away, though whether it was Vegeta he was refusing to look at, or Kakarot, it was not clear. Nail squeezed his shoulder once and then stood and headed back to the house. Kakarot glanced at Chi-Chi, but she remained as she had been, her gaze fixed firmly on her mother-in-law. After a minute Vegeta began to stir, and in another minute he sat up, breathing deeply. He stood, throwing a few punches into the air, and then nodded, satisfied. From the corner of his eye he glanced at Dend. When Frieza is dead and I rule the galaxy, he said, this will not go unrewarded. Dend was so offended by this he looked ready to spit. But Vegeta looked away from him without another word and tensed to take off. Whoa, where do you think you're going? Kakarot demanded, planting himself in Vegeta's path. The prince glared. I'm going to kill Frieza. Kakarot shook his head. My ma's got that taken care of. This isn't your fight anymore, Vegeta. Like hell it isn't. Vegeta bellowed. Didn't you listen to a word I said? Frieza slaughtered my people, tormented me for years. He will die by my hand and no other. He slaughtered her people too. Kakarot shouted. She has just as much right to kill him as you do. You stupid low class. Vegeta actually laughed. Whether it is her right, you think she has what it takes to defeat Lord Frieza himself? Only the legendary Super Saiyan has any hope of killing him, and that, obviously, is me. Kakarot flung out a hand at his mother, who had gotten Frieza by the tail and was spinning him around. She released him and he slammed into the ground. Looks like she's doing a pretty good job to me, he said flatly. Vegeta ground his teeth, but before he could make a retort Frieza exploded from the ground, seething with rage. Enough. The Emperor strained, nearly folding in half with effort, and out of his back sprouted several large spikes. His face and head elongated, growing more grotesque until he looked positively ghoulish. His power spiked massively as he changed, and when Gine charged, sensing a distraction, he batted her away without looking. His transformation finished, Frieza straightened. Stretched. Everyone gaped at him and he grinned. And, you know, this isn't even my final form. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.